Coach Study Cards, Module 5, Ethics and Legal. Training 1. What is scope of practice? Training 1. What is scope of practice? The scope of practice is a term used by national and state licensing boards for various professions that defines the procedures, actions, and processes that are permitted for the licensed individual. Scope of practice. It's determined by the state legislative statute, State Board of Nursing. Scope of practice for nurse practitioners. Determined by state legislative statute, State Board of Nursing, defines the nurse practitioner's roles and actions and identifies competencies assumed to be held by all nurse practitioners who function in a role. It has broad variations from state to state due to potential limitations in existing legislation. It comes from the State Board of Nursing, SBN. Supporting scope of practice, PMHNP displays leadership, advocates for nurse practitioner issues through professional involvement, and joins relevant organizations. What is the difference between scope of practice and standards of practice? The nursing scope of practice describes the tasks that the Nurse Practice Act authorizes for nurses. State Nursing Board. The standards of practice, a related concept, the standards of practice describes how the tasks within the scope of practice should be performed, determined by the ANA, used to judge the nature of care provided. Scope, state. Standards, ANA, national. A pearl here. Answers that require contacting the State Board of Nursing are often correct. On the other hand, if the answer requires you to report your colleague to the supervisor, often it is incorrect, based on the state laws and Nurse Practice Act. Who sets the minimum requirements for NPs? State Board of Nursing, the state. Expect at least 27 questions on this matter. This is the mnemonic for the scope of practice. DSLAIM, D-S-L-A-I-M. Determine. Scope. Legislation. Advocates. Interprofessional. Minimum. It's determined by the state legislative statute, State Board of Nursing. It defines nurse practitioners' roles, actions, and competencies. It varies from state to state due to legislative limitations. Advocates, the PMHNP displays leadership and advocates for NP issues. Interprofessional, there's a collaboration is critical when evaluation is out of scope. And for minimum, State Board of Nursing and states set minimum requirements. This is the mnemonic for scope of practice. Determined, scope, legislation, advocates, interprofessional, minimum. This is the mnemonic for the standards of practice. DJ Pluck, DJPLC. Determined, judge, protocols, law, consistent. It's determined by the American Nurse Association, ANA. It provides a way to judge the nature of the care provided. Standard of care can be legally described, for example, protocols or guidelines. The law requires PMHMP to carry out care per reasonable, prudent criteria. Consistent, providing high-quality care consistent with established standards. The mnemonic for the standards of care, DJ Pluck. Determined, judge, protocols, law, consistent. The standards of nursing practice. Assessment, diagnosis, outcomes identification, planning, implementation, coordination of care, health teaching and health promotion, consultation, prescriptive authority, evaluation, quality of practice, education, professional practice evaluation, collegiality, collaboration, ethics, research, resource utilization, leadership. What are the basic differences? Scope of practice describes the tasks that the Nurse Practice Act authorizes for nurses, State Board of Nursing. Standards, how the tasks within the scope of practice should be performed. ANA, this provides a way to judge care quality. Training 2, confidentiality. What is the purpose of HIPAA? National Standards for Electronic Healthcare Transactions. 1. National ID for providers, health plans, and employers, not simply confidentiality. 2. Big concern with electronic health records. 3. Confidentiality. This is the mnemonic for HIPAA. Never eat red tomatoes during picnic, Chief. Notice, emails, write, transfer, disclosure, psychochemical, confidentiality. Breach of confidentiality. A breach of confidentiality is a disclosure of information to a third party without patient consent or court order. Patient information can only be released with patient's consent in writing or verbal. HIPAA consider the release without authorization only to facilitate treatment or healthcare operations. Ethics. Emergency, threat, hearing, insurance, conditions, safety. The mnemonic is ethics. Training 3, Tarasoff Principle and Court Cases. ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, 1990. ADA is a civil rights law for people with disabilities for the entire lifespan. Under ADA, people with disabilities are entitled to help or reasonable accommodations. People who in previous generations have been institutionalized can now be productive members of society with some of these accommodations available. The mnemonic for legal cases and information is 2 happy owls ran rapidly down 5 steep steps. Tarasoff, duty to warn potential victims. Habeas corpus, protection against unlawful detention, leave against medical advice. O'Connor, cannot confine mentally ill against their will if they can survive outside. Rights, patient rights, least restrictive environment, informed consent. Refuse, Rennie versus Klein, right to refuse treatment. Durham, not criminally responsible if the act was due to mental illness. Ford, must be competent to be executed. Self-refer law, Stark law, can't self-refer for monetary gain. Samples, conflict of interest with pharmaceutical companies. Durham, not criminally responsible if the act was due to mental illness. Ford, must be competent to be executed. Self-refer law, Stark law, can't self-refer for monetary gain. Samples, conflict of interest with pharmaceutical companies. Training number 4. Informed consent. Informed consent involves the nature of treatment, the alternatives, benefits, opportunity for questions, and risks. Informed consent. Care B. Communication questions. Acceptance alternatives. Rights, risks. Emancipated. Benefits. Informed consent. Who can provide a consent? Consent discussed, understanding it's voluntary. Competent. Disclosure. Understanding. Voluntary. Rights summary. Conclude inalienable legal rights. Confidentiality. Informed consent. Least restrictive environment. Right to refuse. Training number 5. What are the ethical principles? They are autonomy, beneficence, fidelity, justice, non-maleficence, and veracity. Ethics. Just knowing better feels very awesome. Justice, non-maleficence, beneficence, fidelity, veracity, autonomy, respect. Training number 6. Research PICO question and levels of evidence. PICO, P-I-C-O-T. P, patient or population. I, intervention. C, comparison. O, outcome. T, time. PICO, P-I-C-O-T. You have a pyramid for the PICO layout. The bottom is editorials or expert opinion. That's the foundation. Then case series and case reports. Then case controlled studies. Next, cohort studies. Then randomized control trials. And lastly, systematic reviews. They're least valuable. Very important to memorize the values of research in order. Number 1, systematic reviews. Number 2, randomized controlled trials. Number 3, cohort studies. Number 4, case control studies. Number 5, case series, case reports. Number 6, editorials and expert opinion. Training number 7, health policy, patient advocacy, and just culture of care. Always assess, address organization barriers and facilitators before meeting with stakeholders. Assess and address organization barriers and facilitators to evidence-based practice first. Assess baseline knowledge, beliefs, and practices using a survey. This is the mnemonic for health policy, to remember all the little details. Raging employees presented fairly irritating evidence. Reform. Environment. Policy making, policymakers. Formulation, first phase of policy making. Implementation, second phase of policy making. Evaluation, third phase of policy making. Patient advocacy. A nurse's advocacy ensures the patient's autonomy and self-determination are respected. Reduce the stigma of mental health illness with education to reduce shame. Help clients receive available services. Advocating promotes mental health by joining organizations such as the ANA and the APNA. Reaching a broader audience when advocating for mental health concerns, reducing stigma. Professional presentations, TV interviews, presentations in schools, and attending town hall meetings. Just culture of care. Health policy, patient advocacy, and just culture of care. Increasing individual accountability by establishing zero tolerance for reckless behaviors. Distinguishes between human error, slips, versus risk behaviors, taking shortcuts versus reckless behaviors, ignoring safety protocols. Collaboration among state boards of nursing, professional organizations, and patient safety centers to create a just culture initiative. Goals. Create an open and fair learning environment to design safe systems and manage choices. Goal to improve systems. Just culture. Providing patient care and a continually improving and designing safe systems. Decreasing system vulnerabilities and managing behavior choices. Just culture of safety. The ANA statement position. 8. Quality improvement and reflective practice. Quality improvement, a project designed to improve the system, decrease cost, and improve productivity. For example, retrospective chart review is an example of quality improvement. This image represents improving the quality of healthcare, quality products, and quality healthcare. The mnemonic PDSA. Plan, do, study, act. In reflective practice, you must link theory to practice. There's debriefing strategies. Providing feedback is a debriefing strategy. Learning from experience. Through reflecting, you can bridge the gap between theory and practice by analyzing situations, understanding your actions, and growing from them. Training number 9. Patient-Centered Care Model, PCC, and Social Determinants. Patient-Centered Care Model and Social Determinants of Health, Patient-Centered Care Model. Patient-centered care model is about putting the patient at the heart of the healthcare experience. It focuses on individual needs and preferences. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Doctors and nurses work with patients to understand their unique goals, concerns, and values. Shared decision-making. Instead of just telling patients what to do, doctors involve them in discussions about treatment options and risk benefits. Patients have a say in their care plans. Respectful collaboration. It's a partnership between the patient and the healthcare team. Open communication, active listening, and building trust are key. There's a holistic approach. Patient-centered care model considers the physical illness and the patient's mental, emotional, and social well-being. Socio-cultural competence. Understand and consider culture, economics, cultural status, health literacy level, family patterns, situations and traditions, including alternative medicine and folk remedies, communication and language differences. Determinants of mental health. The social determinants of mental health are the social and economic factors that influence a person's risk of developing mental illness and their ability to access and benefit from mental health care. Here are some key things to know. They go beyond individual behaviors. It's not just about personal choices, but about broader societal issues like poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to resources. Examples include poverty, housing instability, exposure to violence or trauma, discrimination, racism, limited access to health care and education, social isolation, and unemployment. They disproportionately impact certain groups. People with lower socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ individuals, and people with disabilities are often more vulnerable. They can worsen mental health outcomes. These factors can create chronic stress, hopelessness, and lack of control, increasing the risk of depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. Addressing them is crucial for mental health promotion. By tackling these social issues, we can create a more equitable and supportive environment for everyone, promoting better mental health. Social determinants of mental and behavioral health area emphasizes the role of multi-level social and structural factors in shaping mental and behavioral health, such as stigma, social networks, structural racism, and policies on housing, drug control, and criminal justice. Risk factors for many common mental disorders are heavily associated with social inequalities, whereby the more significant the inequality, the higher the inequality in risk. We have a little table here for breaking up the social determinants of health. Under economic stability, you have employment, income, expenses, debt, medical bills, and support. Under neighborhood and physical environment, you have housing, transportation, safety, parks, playgrounds, and walkability. Under education, you have literacy, language, early childhood education, vocational training, and higher education. Under food, you have hunger, access to healthy options. Under community and social context, you have social integration, support systems, community engagement, and discrimination. Under healthcare system, you have health coverage, provider availability, provider linguistic and cultural competency, and the quality of care. Health outcomes are mortality, morbidity, life expectancy, healthcare expenditures, health status, and functional limitations. An appreciative inquiry. A positive focus inquiry that focuses on strengths and positive experiences of an organization, building on what worked in the past rather than on what did not work.